shifted back and forth. Okay, for those aviators in the room, 1 minute to Charlie. Of course, it's going to be hard for Charlie unless Peter gets back on time. The aviator in the group is the guy who. There he is. 30 seconds to Charlie.
That's right.
Stand down here on the end. As much as possible. Hilo guys should neither be seen nor heard. Unless, of course, you're in the water, and then you want both. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm KJ Delamere, a professor with the Naval War College Fleet Seminar Program. I have the great good fortune to have been asked to fill in for John Scott Logal from the Wargaming department, a good friend of mine with whom I taught strategy up at Newport in residence. And we have a really exceptional panel. So I think I know a couple of them, if nobody objects, and for clarity, will not have their masks on while they're talking. We're going to stay up here at the table. So other than that, today I want to introduce our panelists. Dr. Alan Zim has long experience with Johns Hopkins, and his book on Pearl Harbor takes his operational research experience and applies it to the events that occurred at Pearl Harbor. And so he is taking that level of operational research and his experience. And I'm not really quite sure how you go from a UCLA undergraduate to a USC PhD, but apparently he can reconcile contradicting things fairly well. As a result, he has applied that ability to a particular battle early in the Atlantic campaign, and the manner in which wargaming served to inform what happened in that the commanders and explain what happened in that battle. Next, we have Dr. Norman Friedman. It's very interesting, and I'm greatly honored to be here. The great British historian Jeremy Blackman being introduced once. Somebody said he needed no introduction. And he said, well, that's precisely why I crave an introduction. And I don't know whether Norman craves an introduction or not, but very interestingly, he was part of a discussion group that was hosting a Navy admiral recently. And the admiral said he was a little bit intimidated that an individual whose books he had used and read while he was a midshipman at the Naval Academy was among the audience he was addressing. I'm somewhat older than that admiral, and Norman's book on air power was on my shelf as a midshipman a very long time ago. And then finally, we're going to finish up with Peter Haynes from the Naval Historical Center. Career E2 aviator with vast experience also in special operations. And he's going to take a broader perspective with regard to how historians can inform not just wargaming, but how we employ the forces and how, in fact, the employment of forces and wargaming in turn inform history. So without further ado, I will go directly to Dr.
Okay. I have to second your motion on feeling intimidated by the quality of the gentlemen that are up here. I kind of feel like a high school physics student who's asked to speak before Einstein and Heidelberg. So, you know, what can I say?
Well, not many of us have doctorates in applied physics like some people around here.
We'll go to the first slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of the River Plate. I will start out while you're taking a look at the slide, at the outline of what we're going to talk about. I'll add my first caveat, and that is I'm going to be referring to the British force. In fact, it was not a purely British force. Two of the ships were British. One ship was manned by the Royal New Zealand Navy. And I was thinking about that in an earlier presentation, and I seem to recall that at that time, when they were manning up that ship, the captain was presented by a Maori chieftain with a full battle dress of Maori, and he was told that if he would wear that during battle, the ship would be unscathed. And in fact, during the battle, when the Graf Spee was sighted, the captain came out wearing this huge grass skirt, a big bracelet, and a headdress on him. He wore it through the entire battle. The Achilles, which was the ship they were manning, survived the encounter, taking one set of splinter damage and no hits. So those of you who are thinking of PhD dissertations, I know you're always searching for topics. The impact of native spiritual beliefs on naval trajectories might be an interesting topic for you to take a look at. My only problem is I'm not sure whether that is a liberal arts thesis or a physics thesis. So let's go to the next slide, please. Battle of the River Platte. Let's summarize it. 3 British cruisers met up with a Graf Spee, which was a pocket battleship. They engaged for 82 minutes. The British decided to disengage, and the Graf Spee went into a neutral harbor to possibly be interned, later scuttled itself. So instantly, this was seized upon by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Churchill had been having a rough time as First Lord. He lost the Courageous to a submarine attack when he was out chasing submarines. That made a whole lot of sense. I believe that Churchill likened the Courageous to a cavalry division for some odd reason. He also lost Royal Oak being torpedoed, and so he needed a victory very badly. And as a result, he seized upon this battle, saying, what a magnificent victory. We have defeated the enemy. Our 3 little tiny ships were the underdog. And so consequently, this was a David versus Goliath encounter, and the British David won. Now, of course, the fact that there were 3 British Davids and not just one, details like that never stopped Churchill from marvelous hyperbole. But consequently, let's take a look at one of the justifications he used for saying that they were the underdogs. 6 11-inch guns on the Graf Spee as compared to 22 medium caliber guns on the other 3 ships. When you take broadside weight, that's the weight of a single salvo of guns, the Graf Spee would come out with about a 20 to 25% advantage on that. The problem is that broadside weight, I mean, that made sense when they were actually broadsides with muzzle loading cannons and firing 1 round every 3 minutes. When you're talking about more modern ships, you have to take into account the rate of fire of the gun. You have to take into account the relative damaging capability of the shell. Shells do not, in their damage capability, go up linearly with shell weight. They go up as somewhere between the square root and cube root. Actually, I figured out to be the 2.51 root of the weight of the shell. So consequently, when you do that calculation, add in rate of fire, add in the relative damaging value, the British ships had a 125% advantage over the Graf Spee. And this makes eminent amount of sense. The British had 6 battle groups out hunting for these commerce raiders. They would not put a battle group out there that did not have the capability to finish the job. And so consequently, one would think that Henry Harwood, the Commodore in charge of the force, would have every expectation he would go into this battle and totally destroy the Graf Spee. We'll explore that a little bit later. Armor, let's summarize it. Graf Spee could penetrate all of the armor on all 3 of the ships. Exeter could penetrate the armor on the Graf Spee. Ajax and Achilles could not penetrate the armor on the Graf Spee. So that's those considerations. The last one, and probably the biggest one, is the speed of the ship. Graf Spee had been out at sea for months and months, no overhaul on her engines. One of them had a cracked cylinder head. Design speed 26 knots, actual speed that was achieved during the battle under orders for full speed ahead. Actual speed is 22 knots. The British ships all had design speed of 32.5 knots. They started the battle with boilers offline. The encounter was a surprise to them. They went ahead and lit those boilers off. Their highest speed during the battle by pit log was 31 knots. So consequently, we're looking at a 9-knot speed advantage that the British had. With 9 knots, well, Norman will tell you at the War College, they figure it's anywhere between 1 knot to 3 knots of speed advantage is sufficient to give the higher speed force the control of the battle. They could choose the range in which to engage, and that'll be an important point as we go on here. Next slide. Yeah, this is a very dense slide, and it'll take a minute for me to go through it for you. This center section, which has a laser that doesn't want to work. The center section is the chart of the battle. Right in the center of it, I'm going to go ahead and stand up. In the center here, you have the starting position of the Graf Spee. Down here in the right-hand corner, you have the starting position of the British force in there. Up here on the right-hand side is a plot of the range. This is range, this is time, okay? This lower line is the range from the Exeter to the Graf Spee during the course of the battle. The upper line is the line for the range from the 2 light cruisers, which remained together as a unit to the Graf Spee. So you can divide this battle clearly into 3 quick phases. Phase 1, Exeter cuts off, turns to the northwest, heads directly towards the Graf Spee, cuts her range down to just over 10,000 yards, and the navies at the time considered 10 to 15,000 yards to be decisive range for naval guns. So he was driving directly in for a decisive engagement with the Graf Spee. There was an exchange of fire that lasted about 28 minutes. Exeter came off second best, took 8 11-inch hits. Her 2 forward turrets were totally destroyed. Lost her radio, lost her fire control system, took a hit forward, and was flooding very seriously. Several thousand tons of water came on board. At the end of the battle, it was firing from its aft turret, only 2 guns, one of which had a hoist failure, so it was banging away at 1 gun on local control, and from that point on did not get a shell within 1,000 meters of the Graf Spee. So that was phase 1. Phase 2, I'll add one other curiosity, and this is kind of a cautionary tale for historians. This section right in here with these turns, I have read stories and books of the counting of the battle where they talk about this as being, oh, there was an argument on the bridge. The Langsdorff, the captain, was being opposed, and so they were going to turn away, and he made them turn back. Or they were avoiding torpedoes. All sorts of odd stories. Basically, there was 1 turn made by the Graf Spee, a port turn going to the east, and a second turn going up there. Why is this? Because it's taken from the Admiralty fire control table on the Ajax, and that is an artifact of the mathematics of a fire control table. Okay, so in other words, be careful in the decisions you make based off of track charts. Second phase of the battle was in here. Notice that the light cruisers over once, twice, 3 times all turned away from 15,000 yards to maintain range at greater than 15,000 yards. This is this section in here. And they were banging away at long range and essentially accomplishing nothing. They fired over 2,000 rounds, achieved 4 hits during that period of time. Phase 3 is when Harwood decided right in here that he was going to close the range. And he closed the range down to under 10,000 yards, down to about 7,600 yards exactly. And then he gets a report, which turned out to be false, by the way. He gets a report that his ammunition was down to 20%. Now, if you do the calculations at 7,000 yards range, 20% ammunition was plenty to dispose of the Graf Spee. But at this point, Harwood was working under extreme case of cognitive dissonance, if you know any decision theory, and so he decided to break off the engagement. So we have 4 questions that we need to ask ourselves. Question number 1, why did they split? Why did they not keep their force together? Why did they send, question number 2, why did they send Exeter into 10,000 yards to engage the Graf's Bay? Question number 3 is why did Harwood keep his force out beyond 15,000 yards for such a long period? And question number 4, why did he decide to turn in and close the engagement? Next slide, please. This is Harwood. He was considered an expert on fighting pocket battleships. He was at the Royal Naval College. He taught fighting the pocket battleships there. At the Royal Naval College, they had a war game which known by the document number CB3011. CB3011 war games were fought twice a week at the Royal Naval College. And it is, although I've looked for records of these games, I think I've heard in the grapevine that Dr. Friedman has also looked for these games, have not found any. They were destroyed. They were not kept, and so consequently we can only, it's conjecture, but it's 90% certainty that Harwood would have used CB3011 in developing his tactics. Okay, what do you find in CB3011 that could indicate some justification for the targets they used? First of all, it included something called concentration fire. Concentration fire is when several ships are in formation. The lead ship computes the fire control solution, transmits that by radio to the following ships. They then adjust that solution for their relative displacement from the lead ship, and they all fire simultaneously. So in this case, Ajax and Achilles, Ajax to the lead ship, transmits to the Achilles. They both fire, and you've got 16 shells heading toward the Graf's Bay together. The whole reason for that is that if you're firing separately, you're going to have splash, splash. You don't know whether this is your splash or that is your splash. That's supposed to overcome that difficulty. Magazine hits. Okay, shades of Jutland in the battle cruiser, shades of the Hood in CB3011. For every shell that penetrated armor, you had a 1 chance in 30 of blowing up the ship, blowing up a magazine. So there you go with that. There is something also in the British tactical documents, which is not in CB301. It's called flank marking. When you're looking down the line of fire of spotting your shells, you can determine short, straddle, or over, but that's as best you could do. If you have a ship looking at from a different angle in on you, you then can transmit you were 800 yards over, you were 400 yards short, or whatever. So it's an ability to improve the firing of the ships that are being spotted. Okay, so what does this mean? Concentration fire gave a 15% bonus over 15,000 yards. Is it any mystery now why he maintained over 15,000 yards in there? Mystery one gone. Magazine hits, that explains why Exeter went into close on the Graf's Bay. At close range, Graf's Bay had a firing rate of about 2.5 to 3 rounds per minute. Exeter would have 5 to 6 rounds per minute. Closer in, higher rate of fire, greater chance of getting that magazine explosion. So that's why Exeter ended up closing. Blank marking, that's why they split the force into 2. Next slide, please. Okay, how did it actually work? Concentration fire failed miserably. And the reason is that when you've got 16 shells arcing over and hitting near a target, this is just 3 shells and you can hardly see the ship, okay? Think now of 16 shells, 16 splashes in that area. What ends up happening is a spotter is up there. If you have a straddle, which is good, you only see the front shells, you don't see the ones in the back, and so you mark it as short, and you go through and get an up correction. And during the battle, the British ships consistently fired over the target, fired at too long a range. Magazine hits, there were no magazine hits, so that didn't work on out. Flank marking, Exeter lost its radio very early, I think within the 2nd or 3rd hit, within 10 minutes. They never established flank marking, and so that didn't work. Hit percentages, the British had, if you compare the British hit tables, accuracy tables, with the ones at the Naval War College, you find that the British overestimated the accuracy of long-range fire by a factor of 3 to 35 and underestimated the effect of close-range fire by a factor of about 2. Next slide, please. Oh, one thing I'll mention in there, I went ahead and used CB301 and refought the battle. Okay, I took the track chart, I took all the fire distributions that they used in there, and I refought it, and ended up about 20 minutes into the battle. Graf Spee was noticeably damaged, meaning that it was losing guns and losing speed, and at the 30-minute point, it was dead in the water and destroyed. So if that same type of game was fought by Harwood prior to his going out and taking command of that force, he had every expectation with the force that he had of being able to destroy the Graf Spee within 30 minutes. So consequently, as we're going through there, he goes to the 50-minute point. He's had no discernible effect on the Graf Spee. It's still steaming at high speed. It's still firing 6 guns. That's when he decided, oh my gosh, the boss, Churchill, is expecting me to sink these guys. They've given me enough force in my squadron to be able to sink this guy. I'm not doing any good out at this range. I have to close. And unfortunately, it was a horrible case of lack of situation awareness, not checking with how much ammunition he had before he charges on in there to that close range action. Okay, let's swap over now and go to, so basically I've demonstrated that CB3011 was not a really good model for being able to develop tactics. It didn't do very well. How did the Naval War College maneuver rules go? Well, let's look at something they call fire effect. Fire effect is when the ship is firing in a 3-minute period under a standard set of conditions, and how much of the enemy's life or their survivability you're taking away. So typically a ship will fire for 3 minutes and its fire effect will be 10% of the enemy force. That's fire effect. Relative fire effect is when you include what the enemy's shooting back at you. And so it's force A's fire effect divided by force B. If force A is losing 10% and force B is losing 10%, 10.10 divided out equals 1, equal. Nobody's winning. If you're destroying twice as much as he's destroying of you, it's going to be a 2. You're winning. Next slide. Okay, this is the fire effect, the relative fire effect table of the Graf Spee versus the entire British squadron. Notice that at 4,000 yards, it's very high in here. It's lower down here at longer range, but still positive. So we're looking, I mean, remember a factor of 2 in here. If it's 2, go to the square law. That means the British are going to destroy the Graf Spee and lose 25% of their force. Next slide, please. Okay, so Exeter closes in and gets swacked very quickly, and now it's the Graf Spee against the 2 light cruisers. So what's that relative fire effect in there? You see in here, in the short range, this is at 13,500 yards in there. 13,000 yards and below, they still have an advantage. They still have an almost an average of 2 to 1. Okay, Graf Spee is superior at the longer range. Next slide, please. So basically, the tactics given to you by the Naval War College maneuver rules are almost the exact opposite from what you've got in CB3011. Naval War College says close the range, don't stay outside 15,000 yards, close the range, get into dirty distance, and with the guy, keep your force together and engage that way. Next slide. Now, this is a reenactment of the game using the U.S. Naval War College maneuver rules in here, and this is how much life is remaining on these individual ships, and this is over the time of the battle. Again, we see Achilles. I told you Achilles was untouched. It was actually untouched in the maneuver rules reenactment. Ajax 59% in there. Ajax had lost her after 2 turrets. 50% is a pretty good estimate of that. Exeter, we know it was schwacked. 32% is a good look on that. Graf Spee down to 23%. Now we know Graf Spee should probably be up here, basically this is saying that the Naval War College maneuver rules did a good job of being able to depict and enact the German fire, but the British fire greatly underperformed. And there was it was Keystone Cops on the British. They put a spotter aircraft up. It was on the wrong frequency. When it got on the wrong frequency, it was spotting for the wrong ships. It was a mess. They had smoke interference, all sorts of other problems. So basically, I have managed to run myself out of time. So I'm going to leave things at this point. My conclusion being that 1, models count. Okay. 2 is that you can have bad models. 3 is that you can have good models, and that there is art in divining the difference. And for the naval officers in here, I worked at the Applied Physics Laboratory for 20 years. I presented lots of information to naval officers, and they had to figure out whether I was a good model or a bad model. So it was a challenge. Okay, given that, thank you.
I guess I'll get up.
I guess-
You realize, let's explain what happened to Guadalcanal.
I would,
Seriously,
no,
that's exactly the way Callahan tried it. And
Okay.
it worked.
okay,
Close in,
yep, close
pour
in.
the stuff on, and the guy gets wiped.
Yeah, although he missed a turn to cross the T.
Well, he missed a lot of stuff. It's very interesting because he probably had gone to the War College.
Oh, he
And
had.
he probably had digested exactly what you just shown.
Yeah.
The other thing that you demonstrated, which I would absolutely agree with, is that the British were a lot worse than they thought they were. And if you think you own the world, every once in a while this gets extremely embarrassing. I apologize, it's not part of my pitch. Let's go. Okay. This is a somewhat different view of wargaming in Newport. Part of this is a self-advertisement. I did about a 1-year study of the history of wargaming in Newport between wars for the Naval History and Heritage Command. And the point of it was, I'm not a wargamer. So I wasn't interested in how the models worked and things like that. I was interested in how the wargaming affected the Navy as a whole. That meant that I got to read a hell of a lot of game material. Had I not been paid for it, I would never have done this. However, it was very rewarding. Okay, let's go. First slide. Okay. This is the pitch for what I wrote. I make zero money out of this. You can download it off the NHHC website. Obviously, it's the best thing you could ever read in your entire lives, and you should just, memorize it and all that sort of thing. But what I'm going to talk about is what I learned from that. Next. Now, the biggest thing that the War College does is it supports transformation, which is a somewhat modern word, right? If you look at the Navy before World War I, it's not only a battleship Navy, but it's a very unbalanced battleship Navy. It's a Navy that's intended to fight in the Atlantic, which is a relatively short-range fight. In fact, the main scenario is that the Germans try to grab someplace in the Caribbean, and we enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Am I audible in the back? Okay. We try to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, so we rush down there, and we set up a fleet base, temporary base, and we try to shoot them up. Every once in a while, someone in a War College class asked a subtle question, like, for example, what makes you think that the Germans will be unwelcome in the Caribbean where everyone hates us? That's about 1913, I think. And other questions are, how will you know the Germans are coming? And that's a foretaste of the real problem in the Pacific, which is it's a very big ocean. Okay, so we start off and we get to this. Now, that's pretty amazing if you think about it. The U.S. Navy in 1939 has, what, 7 aircraft carriers? One of them being built. And suddenly you get something like this, which is a lot more than 7. And you get a lot of surface officers who know how to use aircraft carriers very effectively. I mean, Spruance does a pretty good job, and he's a cruiser guy. Now, if you look at the Royal Navy, which is obviously the best Navy ever invented anywhere, and you look at their use of naval air, it's somewhat depressing. They have fantasies about what can and can't be done. Their aviators hate their guts. It's not very happy. We do a hell of a lot better job. Well, how come we know how to do such a good job and they don't get it? The answer to me is that we simulate what a war is like in this weird ocean with all these airplanes. If you look at Naval War College games as early as like 1923, what you see is lots of airplanes. Reeves, who is probably the best early naval aviation officer, fights as the Blue Air Commander in a game, I think like 1923, maybe earlier. He figures out that his airplanes will run out of gas defending the carrier, and they'll just go into the water. So he figures out how to make them stay up. He fuels them more effectively, and he wins the war. It's the only case of a carrier that survives an air attack in one of these games, as far as I know. He ends up devising very effective ways of operating carriers. He had been a surface guy. He wasn't interested in naval air. I think being naval air commander turned him on. So he took pilot training, and he became commander of aircraft in the battle fleet. By the 1930s, the U.S. Navy is more air-minded than any other in the world. The Japanese later say that they followed us, not that they invented it themselves. Next. So how do you this is Langley, it's our first carrier. They see other things when they look at this. Because when you do gaming, you're much freer to invent things. Okay? Next. We also realize that you need mobile support for the fleet. It's a very interesting story. There's a game about 1933. And at this time, the War College had a captain named Wilbur Van Auken. Van Auken had a rough career. He was a very tough character. And he was willing to speak his mind. Remember, you're talking about speaking your mind inside the Navy. You don't call up the Washington Post. And he drew conclusions from different war games. So at that time, the war plan was called the through ticket to Manila. The Japanese start the war by trying to grab the Philippines. It always happened that way. And almost always, there is an exception. And we go to beat up on them because the end game is a blockade of Japan. If you want to blockade Japan, the Japanese battle fleet stands in your way, so you have to erase it. And the idea was you erase it in this big battle. So we fight the big battle near the Philippines, the Surigao Strait, and we win. And then Van Auken looks at how we win, and he says, "Oh, you're real smart. You think you won." Unfortunately, all of your ships suffered underwater damage. So, yeah, you have more ships afloat afterwards than the Japanese do, but only as long as the pumps keep running. Oh dear. Well, we knew the Japanese would probably grab Manila pretty fast, and we arranged anchorages in southern Philippines. There's a place called Tawi-Tawi. There was a bay the name is just gone out of my head. There were 2 or 3 such places. But guess what? They were just places where you could anchor, which were safe from the elements. No facilities. Money was not exactly in large supply. He says, so you get to these places and you anchor, and the fleet lasts how many days? Not good. Now, uniquely, they package this material with his report and they send it to CNO. CNO actually notices. This is amazing. This is the only case I know of where anything from the War College ends up that way. And, oh dear, a war plan is no good. So they change it. They change it to something called step-by-step. Step-by-step means you grab a Japanese island, and as long as you're near Hawaii, that's good enough because you can go back to Hawaii to fix your ships. And then you go to island after island. Later, it's somewhat changed to you grab an island, you use that as a base for bombers, The bombers eliminate Japanese strongholds on nearby islands and you go that way. That's pretty well known. Here's a question. If you look at the Japanese, they get very interested in land-based naval aircraft, long-range bombers, Nels and Bettys. And initially, at least, the point of that is reconnaissance. One of the things you learn in these war games is reconnaissance really counts. There's a game in 1933 or 34, must be 34, in which the scenario is kind of weird. If we can reach Petropavlovsk, the Russians will come into the war. We just recognize the Soviet Union. But the way it's rigged by the staff at the War College, Japanese normally have submarines around Pearl Harbor. Their job is to notice when the fleet comes out and where it's going. In this particular game, it's rigged so that the submarines don't get it. They don't see the fleet come out. And what happens is the Japanese commander goes nuts because he's lost track of the enemy. It takes him 3 weeks to find the US fleet. Now it happens that in this 3 weeks, we haven't done anything very useful. But the lesson, if you were a student, was, reconnaissance is sort of life and death. And if you look at World War II, reconnaissance is life and death. And oh, by the way, something that you don't see in the games is that a lot of the navigation isn't that good. So yes, I see the Japanese fleet there. Oh, I'm saying it's over there. Oh dear. Read about Midway, right? Anyway, keep going. So this is a magnificent achievement by the War College, right? They've just changed the entire US Navy war plan. The National War Plan changes with that. Douglas MacArthur is forced to sign on to it, including, by the way, admitting that we won't relieve the Philippines and the Army there is going to go down the tubes. The Army prefers not to remember this afterwards. You never guess, right? Anyhow, so if you want to look at this, the first thing is, it really pays to think about these games because you'll get a feel for what a Pacific War would be like, you know? And then you can say, well, but it didn't work out like that. And that'll make you ask questions. The only bad part is you got to read a lot of war game material, which you may prefer not to. Second, you can see how our thinking changed, and it raises interesting questions. But the other question is, what are the Japanese doing during this time? When the Japanese build up a lot of land-based air in the Pacific, are they reacting to step-by-step? Are they reacting to some other idea that they have? You see, one of the problems of step-by-step for the Japanese is, where is the American fleet going? How do you predict which island we grab? Now, in addition, we tried very hard to keep step-by-step secret. So the question is, how well did we do? How good was their intelligence before the war? These are not questions I can answer. I'm putting them out to you because you're historians too, and they might be interesting subjects. Now, here's another weird one. You can think of this 1934 report as a high point of War College power, right? The War College is there as part of OPNAV. Literally, it's literally the lab for a lot of OPNAV thinking. That's a very important job, right? And it's fulfilled this function by this report. What could be better, right? Okay, now here's what happens. The president of the War College quits halfway through his 2-year term. I've forgotten the man's name. He was, Luke McNamee. I did remember his name. He was a very good naval officer, and he was one of the Navy's intellectuals. He was very hot stuff. He leaves. He leaves to become president of, I think it's Federal Teletel, a radio company. Now, remember that radio and comms matter a lot, so you can imagine a situation where someone rings him up and says, we really need you there. Leave. The War College gets shipped over to the Navy education system. If you look at discussions of Navy decisions afterwards, the War College doesn't contribute the way it did before. And by the way, the way it did before was very significant. War College discussions shaped the carriers before World War II. I mean, shaped in detail. In 1930, after we signed the London Naval Treaty, question of what sort of cruisers we were building came up. That may seem like peanuts now, but it was a very big thing then. The British had set up the treaty deliberately to cause everyone to build small El Chico cruisers so that they would not go out of business. By the way, two of them are the ones that fought at the River Plate. CNO was very Anglophilic. He comes home absolutely filled with this stuff. Oh, and he says, you know, what does the War College think of it? If you look back at the method of decision that you're taught at the War College, to me, the biggest part of that is a step in which you ask not just what the enemy needs, but how the enemy looks at it before you figure out what you want to do. Okay? If I look at discussions by the British, that step doesn't happen, period. We're the best, so you know everyone else is too stupid to live. And what we did was we looked at what the Japanese would probably want in cruisers. We figured out they'd be pretty big ones, so we built big cruisers. And this Brooklyn class is a very big deal. That's the way the War College was supposed to do its job when it was taken seriously. All right, I don't know the answer to this question. There are all sorts of possibilities. One possibility is that the Navy was on the point of expanding rapidly, and the thought was that the most important thing the War College could do was educate a lot more officers. That's entirely possible. Another possibility is that they had rubbed some officers completely raw, and this was their revenge. I don't know enough about those personalities. It seems to me to be a really interesting question. If you look at what happens afterwards, I look, for example, for an article I wrote for Dr. Kuhn. If you look at the battleships we built, the General Board, which probably still reflected some War College experience at that time, pushed strongly for a carrier escort. That's a relatively lightly armed battleship with very high speed. CNO decided he wanted something more standard, which was slower, with more armor and heavier guns. It wasn't that slow. It's in North Carolina. But the next one was going to have heavier guns and needed heavier armor, and they were going to sacrifice speed. It's going to be a 24-knot ship, which is good luck. It only gets higher speed when we find out the Japanese are faster than we thought, a lot faster. As you heard, speed advantages can be quite unpleasant. That's a very different view than the way the War College was looking at things. Was the War College pushing airplanes too hard? Well, except when they change, this step-by-step stuff requires a lot of airplanes. They're not the same. They're not fighters and dive bombers. They're big seaplane bombers. But you know, all the big seaplanes had bomber designations. Now, if you look back, it's somewhat funny. But at the time, it seemed like a reasonable idea. There was a belief that you could shape a seaplane hull so it could have high performance. Duh, I don't know the answer. But if you're looking for something to think about, this is kind of interesting. And what better thing can I give you than a couple of good questions? That's it. Thank you.
I think BJ wanted us to read from the table. For reasons that will come clear soon enough, the views expressed are those of the author, do not reflect the official policy or the position of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Navy. For the U.S. Navy, the need for applied naval history is acute. It's been 100 years since the Navy prepared for war in a globalized era, 75 since it waged great power war at sea, and 50 since it had to reorganize to confront a great power rival capable of contesting the seas. And as C&O Gilday noted today at the lunch, for the first time in a generation, our country is engaged in a great power competition during a period of rapid technological change. We continue noting the competition is largely an intellectual contest as we seek to outthink our potential adversaries by broadening and deepening our warfighting knowledge. And as sailors, we find ourselves wondering how our predecessors confronted similar challenges. Unfortunately, the relationship between Navy leaders and naval historians is not in a state to answer the bell. The dialectic is impoverished and a relationship devoid of a functioning interdependency needed for naval history to be of real consequence. To help answer the bell, this paper sets expectations before examining the nature of the relationship and how to revitalize it. In setting expectations, let there be no illusions. As John Hatdorf noted, in contrast to officers in other branches of service, naval officers have tended to ignore the value of and advantages to be found in historical insights. One certainly doesn't have to look too far. Given the emphasis on STEM, the 19% budget cut to the Naval War College, Naval Postgraduate School, and Naval Academy will no doubt fall on the humanities. The Naval History and Heritage Command is at bare steerage weight. Its operating budget has been cut 70% since 2016, and it can no longer afford its current website or to publish hard copy books such as Norman Friedman's Winning a Future War, which I highly recommend. I'm about halfway through it right now, and it's wonderfully insightful every page. For its part, as an academic discipline, naval history has been reluctant to make itself relevant to the pragmatic challenges of the naval services and shies away from wading into wider, more public strategic discussions. As Nick Roger noted, the literature lacks for cause and effect analyses, which forestalls attempts to locate naval history within its national and international contexts. Buoyed by public interest, naval history has been content with battles and stories of heroism. Since in historiographical terms, navies have always attracted but a fraction of scholarship compared to armies, any additions are certainly to be welcomed. As an academic discipline itself, history is imperiled. No discipline has seen the steepest decline in bachelor's degrees awarded. Not since 1950 has history accounted for a smaller share of undergraduate degrees, imperiled even more are subfields like military and diplomatic history. Paul Kennedy noted it's the faculty that doesn't seem to think that they're important enough, while Gordon Wood stated social and gender approaches have pushed to the margins traditional ones that dealt more directly with matters of statecraft war and geopolitical competition. As a result, as Hal Brands noted, the scholarship policy gap is real and it is widening. Colin Gray was correct when he noted, despite a glittering record of strategic accomplishment in the 20th century, sea power has not attracted the balanced appreciation that it deserves. As he stated, ignorance of sea power continues to detract from the potential effectiveness of U.S. national security policy and strategy. Turning to the nature of the relationship between Navy leaders and naval historians, one finds it formed as a result of rapid, unsettling changes in technology and the structure of the global economy in the late 19th century. Not unlike the current security environment, the expansion of the global economy fueled the rise of great power rivals, global commercial empires, high-tech industrialized navies to symbolize great power status and ensure access to far-flung markets. Navy leaders, to their credit, realized the institution's operational experiential knowledge base was far too narrow to ensure adaptation in an era of fundamental change. They sought to broaden the institution's warfighting knowledge by educating naval officers on history and technology, particularly via war games, generally in light of Mahan's theory of decisive battle. Mahan argued that the most effective way to command the sea was to build an offensive fleet and destroy the enemies in a quick and decisive engagement. The prospect that the balance of power could change in an afternoon demanded a single-minded focus on battle. In other words, the need to educate naval officers was profound and pragmatically so. During this era, the foundational figures of modern naval history, such as Lawton, Corbett, and Richmond, midwife naval history, arguing it was essential to the formation of naval strategy and therefore victory at sea. Before then, as Corbett noted, naval history was merely a weapon of partisanship, a kind of dust heap from which a convenient brick may be extracted to hurl at opponents. Due to their efforts, naval history, which was an academic subject until the First World War, became an independent field of study. The fact that, as Andrew Lambert noted, naval history was first and foremost a study for navies, and secondly, a study of navies, increased the importance of the relationship and made its success contingent on collaboration between the two. The Navy's relationship is more important and requires far more upkeep than those of the other services, which is due to fundamental differences in operating environments. While the others are more accessible conceptually and physically, the Navy's operating environment is more distant, alien, hostile, and wholly dependent on technology. Due to its operating environment, the Navy holds preeminent the value of experiential knowledge. The superior form of knowledge and the basis of authority remain operational experience and technological know-how. So writing history for naval officers requires understanding naval operations and naval technology, which requires collaboration, if not immersion in operations, and the Navy's dim and peculiar institutional world, neither of which is easy for historians. Echoing Corbett, Dave Rosenberg stated that naval history is a field which requires integrating the knowledge and experience of the historian with that of the naval officer. With all this in mind, how can naval historians support Navy leaders? Finding ways to collaborate and support senior naval leaders requires understanding how their lives are structured, how they think, and the problems they're solving. As Americans, Navy leaders are monochronic. They focus on one issue at a time in isolation and make decisions on the merits of the information at hand. Given deadlines, there's little inclination to find experts and ask for historical insights. As a historian assigned to a Navy staff would be astounded at the lack of historical knowledge informing decisions, yet equally surprised at the desire for history and historical discussions, particularly among the junior officers. The lives of those that work in the Pentagon are structured by the budget process. As a Navy officer noted in the late 1960s, practically the entire OPNAV organization is tuned like a tuning fork to the vibrations of the budgetary process. There is a vast preoccupation with budgetary matters. In the Pentagon, the key to the realm is systems analysis. It's a place where historical-based arguments rarely find purchase. Between the primacy of operations at sea, limited opportunities for resident postgraduate programs, and the mind-warping emphasis on quantitative analyses and programmatics, the knowledge base of Navy officers has again narrowed. As a result, as Dave Rosenberg noted, Navy leaders address problems not from a theoretical or historical perspective, but a narrower, more analytic one. This is not to say that historical insights are unwelcome, really that they're not considered. It's all too easy for Navy leaders to give in to a reactive inbox-focused mindset and view time as a commodity better spent on getting things done by open-ended conceptual questions. In reality, time is spent on finding definitive answers to technical questions by tentative answers to fundamental ones. Coming from a monochronic, by say polychronic culture means that time is valued more than relationships and networks. And Navy leaders have little time to develop either to inform or to expand their thinking. This is unfortunate as staff work, trust me, dulls the intellect and constricts thinking. As Colin Gray noted, it can be a revelation that armed forces have been so self-absorbed in the complex task of managing themselves that they forget what they are for. So what can naval historians glean from the above? First, given the insular nature of the decision-making process, historians have to work at understanding the problems of Navy leaders and gaining access. Applied naval history consists of understanding contemporary history and the nature of today's problems, finding historical parallels and relating the two. But it's not just what Navy leaders are thinking about, but what should they be thinking about? As Jeff Till noted, the chief utility of history for the analysis of the present and the future lies in the ability not to point out lessons so much, but to isolate things that need thinking about. Second, understanding these problems and gaining access requires developing networks and collaborating with points of entree. One readily comes to mind, Peter Schwartz, the former CNA strategic analyst and Navy captain who helped author the Maritime strategy in the 1980s. A few other names are found in the acknowledgement sections of naval books, the authors, mine included, than Peter's. A member of the Navy's strategy community for 50 years and a fixture at McMullen, Peter spends extraordinary time mentoring naval historians from across the globe, and naval history has benefited, as has the Navy. He and others like Randy and Tom Hone can help identify leaders that have commissioned applied naval history projects, such as Bruce Stubbs and Rear Admiral Tom Williams. Third, after getting an entree, historians need to think creatively about how to approach senior officials to get them to read papers or proposals. The last thing you want to do is send them a 5,000 word paper in the blind. Instead, use an OPNAV approved template for a bulleted one-page information paper that describes your argument and attach the paper as an enclosure. All too often, historians believe their arguments require 20 pages. Unless one writes clearly and boils the essentials down to a page, which shows respect for the time of the senior officials, Navy leaders will be far less inclined to read it. When writing for Navy leaders, narrative takes a backseat to analysis and explanation. Whether a 10-page paper or a book, a narrative that limits itself to description and not analysis or explanation will be dismissed out of hand. Do not be afraid to make controversial arguments. Navy leaders are a lot more accepting of institutional criticism than one might expect, but the argument does have to be explicit. You can offer brown bag lunch discussions, particularly in the Pentagon, which are invariably welcomed by staffers, but allow plenty of time as the discussions will be lively. Fourth, many Navy leaders do their more conceptual reading in the evenings, on travel, or while on leave. Some like John Richardson, a longtime supporter of naval history, devour three or four more books per week. As such, annotate a recommended reading list of books and articles with links that reflect current issues or a particular leader's priorities, position, and travel plan will indeed be welcomed. Turning now to how Navy leaders can support naval historians. First, Navy leaders should sit down with historians and archivists from the likes of NHHC, the War College, the Naval Academy, and U.S. and allied think tanks and universities. Find out who has the expertise, what projects are afoot, what books are about ready to be published, and what challenges historians are facing. Particularly valuable discussions with emeritus historians, John Hattendorf, those too few figures who are old hands at organizing collaborative efforts and applying naval history. Second, as an overarching institutional construct, Navy leaders need to revive the Secretary of the Navy's Advisory Subcommittee on Naval History, SNAS, which hasn't been convened since 2008. Its 15 members consist of historians like John Hattendorf and Dave Rosenberg, former civilian leaders and flag and general officers and captains and colonels, mostly from the strategy community. The SNAS advises SecNav on matters of history and heritage that address priorities, funding, and establishing cooperative relationships in terms of museums, libraries, archives, and art, as well as historical research and publication. Even a more modest construct, one limited to naval history, would be welcomed. Without SecNav support, efforts to develop a collaborative relationship will certainly fail. Third, Navy leaders can jot down a list of priorities and conceptual challenges to historians or ask NHAC or others, like the War College and the Naval Academy, to organize roundtables in the Pentagon or at McMullen or SMH. One term of the Joint Chiefs of Staff tasks his Joint History Office, of course, the CNO or SecNav have no such office, to organize a one-day offsite consisting of 4 panels of historians. They talk about policy questions that they shape that thinking. So because the next day is a closed-door session with only the chairman and his J-code heads, and so the first day informs, and the second day they actually talk about those strategy and policy discussions. Fourth, Navy leaders should work with the Navy Department historians in the Office of Legislative Affairs to reshape declassification laws and making the process far more amenable for researchers. As the former assistant director at NHHC for Histories and Archives noted at McMullen in 2017, historical researchers are faced with a confusing labyrinth of policy rules and program execution decisions affecting access to Navy records that makes research and writing on post-World War II Navy almost impossible. The rules are difficult to understand and vary according to the official, who are invariably risk-averse and have little appreciation for history. In particular, leaders need to change the Navy policy on Kyle-Lot to align with the less restrictive approaches of the other services. Navigating these minefields without endangering security clearances has discouraged historians from using declassified material. Many are well aware of the nightmare that Dave Rosenberg has had to live through. As a result, historians limit their dissertation topics or research to the Age of Sail or the World Wars. The literature on how the Navy organized in the last era of great power competition, the Cold War, is woefully thin. Finally, Navy leaders should invite historians to study and participate in war games. Few other venues convey an understanding of how Navy leaders think, how they define and approach problems, and what types of challenges they're facing. War games offer an immersive experience that catalyzes ideas on applied history and offers a venue where you can really see Navy decision-making and Navy officers in their element. As Norm noted, as a laboratory, war games provide a revealing look into how the Navy is attempting to transform itself technically, tactically, and strategically. and adapting conceptually and materially. Since neither the US nor China has fought a great power war in decades, and here I'm echoing Norm's book, it's critical to understand how they're confronting new technologies like cyber, and Norm equates naval aviation then to cyber today, and how they did so in the past. And concluding, the lack of a collaborative relationship detracts from the Navy's efforts to transform itself in an era of fundamental change. By contrast, the Chinese are leveraging their instruments of knowledge. They are students of history, studying ours as well as their own. As Sun Tzu advised, self-knowledge is critical, a sentiment the importance of which isn't well appreciated in the US Navy. In a decade when the Chinese have published 10 scholarly applied historical works on Mahan alone, for example, it's not unreasonable to ask whether Chinese naval historians are outcompeting American naval historians. If great power competition is, as C.N.O. Gilday noted, an intellectual contest, then in terms of naval history, the Navy is surely losing that competition. Thank you.
So at this point, I'd like to invite our commentator, Professor John Scott Logal from up at Newport, to join us.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up from KJ would help. Perfect. I am so excited to be a part of this panel, and my biggest regret is that I'm not there with you all. We had to take care of the kids this week with some surgery, so I'm fortunate to be here with you all. This today has been phenomenal, listening to our presenters. I commend all three of you for your timely and important insights at this moment in 2001, where the nation and its security prospects center on the capabilities and the readiness of the United States Navy. Thinking about these papers, we have three distinct lenses to connect war games, the Navy's past, and the present challenges in an era of competition with China, Russia, and to a lesser degree, Iran. Alan Zim asks us to consider how tactical wargaming practices translate into application in battle. Norman Friedman's questions caution today's naval leadership to draw not only tactical and technical insights from war games, but also to create understanding of the operational implications for conducting maritime warfare in the next war. And Peter Haynes argues that today's naval leaders need to apply naval history in support of their other efforts to transform the maritime forces and win in the era of great power competition. As a wargamer and as a historian, I fully endorse what these three papers are advocating. They're singing my tune. First, from my vantage point at McCarty Little Hall here in Newport, I can report that the wargaming renaissance, encouraged by the likes of Bob Work, Phil Cornell, B.J. Armstrong, and Jim Lacey back in 2014, is still happening. In the gaming rooms and the skiffs throughout DoD, more and more flag officers and general officers are not only attending the war games, they are staying and playing in these events for the duration. In 2014, we often concluded our Title X war games at the college with several flag officers and general officers arriving on the last day. They'd watch a move, they'd observe some of the gameplay, and then they'd receive the final plenary briefs from the players who had been there all week. Since 2016, at the behest of C.N.O. Greenert and C.N.O. Richardson, the fleet commanders, the joint component commanders, their staffs, and subordinate commanders have been playing operational and strategic war games with their war plans and their concepts at the highest security classifications. Admiral Swift, Franchetti, Aquilino, Paparo, as well as dozens of 3 and 4 stars have invested their precious time and energy leading and making operational decisions in the game rooms at Newport. They are players. They're not just observers anymore. We are in the midst of a wargaming era approaching that of the global games of the 1980s. The gap between those FOGO operators and those who are doing programmatic decisions at OpNav at the Pentagon is closing. And it's evidenced by the fact that the DCNO cells are coming and spending a full week for the global war games in Global 11 in 2019, and they're planning to do so again this year. The catalyst was a conversation with the wargaming department chair that he had with Vice CNO Moran in 2016, advising that OpNav was mainly uninformed on the war plans of the fleets, the commanders, the combatant commanders, but yet OpNav is responsible for adequately supporting them with the man, train, equip responsibilities. How could the DCNOs do that job when they really had no understanding of the issues that the operators, the combatant commanders, are having and dealing with? So Moran sensed these issues, and immediately what came about in the last 18 months are 2 logistics games, war games for OpNav N4. I could say that this FOGO commitment to wargaming is because of the great work of my wargaming department colleagues and what we're doing, but that would be way too disingenuous. The reality is that these senior naval flag and general officers have come to realize what all 3 of our presenters have argued. Wargaming is a powerful tool to understand the complexities and significant challenges created by the prospect of war with a near-peer adversary, and especially that in the 21st century. War games and history are never predictive. We've seen that argued here in these papers. Rather, they are sources to understanding a range of outcomes in any potential battle. More importantly, war games enable players to identify circumstances and outcomes where one's chosen course of action may be irreversible or unrecoverable. In planning terms, war games reinforce where a decision maker is likely to have increased risk, and war games have the power to offer ways to mitigate or offset that risk. For more than a century at Newport, playing and analyzing war games have created the habits of mind for the officers to conduct war at sea. With respect to Alan's thesis, I would challenge him to reconsider the certainty that Hardwood's decisions at the Battle of River Plate were a direct result of his playing with the CB 311 rules, or that the conduct of the U.S. naval gun engagements reflected U.S. Naval War College maneuver rules. Short of a direct quote to attribute that, or from Admiral Harwood or his peers, I think at best it's a hypothesis that the correlation between the wargame rules and the actual tactical battle execution, it's really hard to make that connection. Which comes first, the timing and procedures for actually firing the ship's guns, or the conditions desired to be modeled in the wargame? I would submit that the practical informed the simulated during the interwar period. I think Trent Hone has it about right in his book Learning War when he describes the significance of connections among the war games, the experimentation, and fleet problems. Indeed, the adjudication tables, the adjudication process, capabilities used in the war games must be treated as assumptions. More importantly, no war game can ever be predictive. There are infinite variables within the humans making the decisions both in the games and in battle. Nevertheless, Allen's analysis of the war games and the battles support how influential these games are in creating the habits of mind for Harwood and his forces. More importantly, his paper is a model of how to reconcile the realities of a maritime capability and improve the simulated environment in a war game. All models are wrong, some are useful. Zim's research reinforces this maxim. It's a maxim that not all in the wargame enterprise truly understand or appreciate. Any adjudication model or process abstracted for war gameplay seeks to use the best available data, and it enables users to understand the limits of that model or simulation. Wargame designers would be prudent to consider Allen's paper and his method of analysis as they create today's games. Norman Friedman's paper on the interwar wargaming at the Naval War College resonates because he highlights the way the war games enable the officers to think about new and emerging technologies in maritime warfare. The games enabled transformation. These interwar games increasingly featured naval aviation operations, submarine employment, and logistics considerations, all of which became leading factors in the conduct of the Pacific War. Today's war games similarly account for newer and emerging capabilities in space and cyber warfare. As Nora points out, the interwar games could sometimes be unrealistic and overlook the realities of coalition maritime warfare on the game floor. In 2021, the Navy's war games need to integrate those factors that may be unlikely but possible in a future war. To get after why the Navy fell out of favor in the mid-1930s, I would encourage Friedman and those interested in following his questions expand upon his research to the letters, official correspondence, diaries, and archival material that these interwar War College graduates used and fought with in World War II. As historians of the interwar period continue to find evidence connecting the interwar preparation with the wartime conduct of maritime operations, we need to get beyond the Nimitz quotes of 1960 and 1961. Phillips O'Brien's History of the War leverages Ernie King's war notes from December of 1942 to demonstrate the prior experience of the War College in his conference with Nimitz. Admiral King specifically reflects on the outcomes of the Newport War Games as he prepares to go to conference in 1942. When we find limits or gaps in the archive, our research needs to fill in those gaps. If we are truly to understand the nexus between wargaming and the performance in the wars that follow, we have to get back into the archives. The other challenge of wargaming then and now that Friedman brings to our attention is the dual nature of what wargaming does. One, it provides decision-making experiences. And two, it provides data for analysis. Inner war games, particularly the blue-orange operational war games, created the experiences that enable those habits of mind. And as President of Naval War College Admiral Harris Landing recognized in 1932, the war games created data for analysis of the blue-orange problem. Right? So Landing directs Captain Wilbur Van Auken to write his 1933 Naval War College report on the blue-orange games. They had the data from 1927 to 1933. And as Norm told us, it became a critical report for the CNO to change his plans in Washington. And as Norm's question suggests, there much remains to be researched and work to be done in the Naval Historical Collection, the NHC, in the archives here at Newport. The archives here are presently closed for renovation of Mahan Hall. But this leads me to Peter Haynes' paper. Peter's paper is indeed a caution not only to us historians, but to the Navy's leadership writ large. Given the budget casualties of the NHHC and its Naval Reserve Unit this fiscal year, I'm highly concerned about the future of the college's Naval Historical Collection to return to Mahan Hall in Newport by 2023, if it returns at all. The collection is a treasure and a resource that is indispensable to the conduct of applied history and the work we all do. As Peter so eloquently describes in his paper, the declining numbers of military history majors and programs in academia has been occurring for more than 2 decades. However, those universities that do offer military and conventional histories of war demonstrate that there is still a demand for those classes. Simply said, military history courses put cheeks in the seats. I can also attest to the demand for naval history by our senior admirals and captains. During our war games here in Newport, every Pac Fleet commander from Admiral Swift to Admiral Paparo has invoked a quote or vignette from Horn Fisher or Toll. I would submit that the demand for naval history remains stronger than ever. Peter is spot on with this challenge for us historians to communicate more effectively with Navy leaders. Our admirals and captains are analytical, and they consume their information in ways that they can apply it and make practical use of it. Indeed, our wargaming reports have executive summaries of only 6 to 8 pages, and the so what has to be on the first page or two. Lastly, naval histories need to be relevant to what is on the minds of leadership. The Cold War competition with the Soviet Union resonates with the likes of the CNO, Admiral Davison, and Vice Admiral Munch in the Joint Staff J7. Peter Schwartz, Dave Rosenberg, John Hanley, John Lehman, and the rest of the 1980s generation have been carrying the load for our understanding of the Cold War Navy. Peter Haynes is right in saying that we need to get the Cold War records declassified. For example, in the War College's classified library are the classified game reports from the 1970s and 1980s. There is so much in them that our new historians could research and write about, but there are challenges in declassifying these games. As an example, I'll offer the unchanging geography of the sea floor and the enduring nature of designated submarine operating areas as impediments to declassification. Regardless, we need to get past the sea story narratives of the Cold War and enable our best and brightest naval historians to work with those collections, publish, and be a source of wisdom for our naval leaders now. Again, I am so grateful for the work of this panel. These papers are important not because of their conclusions. They are important because of the vital ongoing conversation they inform for our profession, and more importantly for our Navy. Thanks to Alan, Norman, and Peter, and thank you, KJ, for leading us this afternoon.
So first, I'd like to open it up to the panel. If you have any comments based on John Scott's observations, or we can go to questions.
Just a comment. There's another aspect of naval history that's been kind of left out. It's very important to engage not just with the public at large, but if you think about the way that policy people in Washington learn their trade, we're left out. What they think of as security studies typically is about Army things or strategy, which really means how fast you can vaporize somebody. Navies look at things really differently. I'll give you an example. what happened in World War II in the Pacific? Was it that the Japanese started a war and we finished it? Or was it the Japanese grabbed something of ours and we had to get it back? If you're Army, it's the second one. What they grabbed was the Philippines, which we own. But by the way, we're planning to dump. If you're a Navy, the Japanese are the problem, and the answer is they lose and they give back whatever they grabbed. If you read the Army official history, it's about the Philippines. That's the first volume of their history. How does it start? Give me a break. Unless we can make people in Washington understand that it isn't that simple, we'll often have problems. I was doing some work on the origins of maritime strategy. If you look before President Carter, people understand there's probably not going to be a big war in Europe, but there'll be things on the edges of Eurasia, and the Navy is the instrument for handling those things. Makes a lot of sense. Carter comes in, declares that everything outside of Europe is the North-South problem and the evil of the United States. I know somebody in his campaign, that's why I got this. Guess who loses? And surprise, surprise, the world doesn't operate the way he thinks. By the way, he resists reality very hard. It's important that we get it across outside of our own community, okay? Having stirring accounts of what happened in World War II isn't enough. And oh, by the way, don't bet that Van Til or Hornfisher got it right. I once heard Van Til speak, and you'll be interested to hear that we didn't understand airplanes until after Pearl Harbor. Huh? And there was a lot of stuff like that. Don't bet on civilians. They don't always get it right. We ought to have more people who get it right. They don't have to have PhDs in naval history. I realize that's bad news for whoever runs universities. But it's very important for the Navy to encourage historians, popular historians too. NHHC in the past has been a kind of connector to that community. That's a very important job. It's easy to forget. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 30 minutes. We have some questions. Let's
I
start with
would
Ed
like to-
Marola.
Norman's, what you just said about the state of naval history, and Peter, your comments, this is a long-term problem. I remember John Hattendorf's Ubi Sumus in the 1970s, the parlous state of naval history. It's a situation. The situation with the Navy archives is what I want to address directly.
Amen,
It's
brother.
impossible to do research in that. When I was in the Naval History Center, the Naval History Heritage Command, we spent millions of dollars to hire a contractor to review and declassify a lot of Cold War material, which the American public cannot get to. I can't get to. I don't have a security clearance or a government contract. That's not right. I would say if this situation doesn't improve, and it's gotten worse since when I was there, we should really consider the Navy archives being transferred to the National Archives. They have a much more liberal approach to declassification and the use of these materials. The Navy is just, they don't have the understanding what is there and who needs to see it. Another thing, just to follow on, is the Naval History and Heritage Command going out and doing directed studies with Navy commands like the 6th Fleet History, 7th Fleet History. We did those in the past. We actually responded to a customer's request. So we do, is that sort of thing being done now, Peter, or not?
No. Well, it tends to be by request. So if Jamie Fogo with 6th Fleet, he'll go, hey, can you matter of fact, Tom Mahone has written a book on 6th Fleet for an NHAC contract, and that book hasn't left NHAC. But when I first got to NHAC about 2 years ago, Norm and I were emailing because I just left CSBA, and he was in he gave us all these ideas. And so I actually took those ideas and brought Christina Giannata, who is our head of the History and Archives Division, and actually went into the Pentagon and sat down with aviators, submariners, and other folks going, this is Norman Friedman. He wants to do a study for you, and then particularly the N97 guys, the submariners. And the answer was, yeah, that's great, but no, we don't really kind of see the see the value. So unfortunately.
You gonna follow up, John?
Well, I wanted to comment on what Norman said, and particularly what Peter said, is I think one of the problems here, guys, is access. You know, how do you get access to these guys? I mean, it's not every day that Captain Barney Rubble comes in and says, you get to have dinner literally next to the CNO, and he will have you talk to a bunch of admirals around the table, as well as him, as well as the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks. And that occurred in 2017 about history. So access is key. You've got to have, and you've got to be ready for it. Sometimes access comes at the most unexpected times. Yeah, you might be in the head, and and Vice Admiral pulls up next to you. So I mean, access is a difficult thing, particularly in this business, the naval history business. All right. So you got to be ready for it when it comes, and you have to actively seek it out, like guys like Tom Hone and Norman Friedman have done, and Peter Hayes. And you got to be ready to tell these guys and put it in their language, short, succinct language. When we talk about naval history, Admiral, we're talking about an after-action report, a naval historical perspective, or an after-action report of the game, a real game that killed people and resulted in different sort of political outcomes from warfare. And just give it to them like that and put it in their language. Don't put it in your academic language, put it in their language. And I think you'll get there. I mean, I'm really passionate about this. I got to participate in it, but I sense, like with Peter and Norman, that it's sort of slipping away from us, that access piece. But we've got the young guys here, and so it's not something that's just going to come down to you on a platter and be granted to you. You have to be ready for it. You have to develop it. You might go off and get a master's degree in military history at a P&E institution, either a graduate certificate of maritime history at the Naval War College or at the Air Command and Staff College, or even, God forbid, out of Fort Leavenworth, where I am, and and work with me, and who knows what'll happen. But it's got to be worked at. You can't assume that the problem is just going to solve itself. We are the solution. So I'll get off my stump now. I had a question for you, Norman, but I forgot what it was.
The answer is 5/4.
I'm Everett, and actually work at NRL in my day job. My question fundamentally gets to Peter Haynes, but my curiosity is thinking of recent famous Army officers like David Petraeus or John Abizade or H.R. McMaster, all of whom have graduate educations in the humanities. I can think of no comparable recent naval officer of major import with similar education. And I even look at naval education formation, such as requiring all naval ROTC students to take a year of calculus and chemistry so that they're basically qualified, so that they can go through nuke school. Or, for instance, nuke school, or where all submarine officers are back of the boat people, whereas unlike the Royal Navy, where there's the split between those who are front of the boat people and those who are back of the boat people, right? And so part of me wonders if this lack of historical appreciation comes from just how naval officers are formed and trained, all the way from being a midshipman to being a junior officer and all the way up to flag rank. And I'm just curious as to your all's opinion.
Well, I would take issue on a couple of points, only that there's a famous story about Admiral Crowell that supposedly is a one-star. He was in his office. He was being interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist asked what it was like to be one of the only flag officers in the U.S. Navy with a PhD. And supposedly slammed the door shut and started yelling at the reporter, "Do you want me never to be promoted again?" And there is a little grain of truth in that story. I was the EA for Admiral Pat Walsh out at Fifth Fleet. And before that, I was his director of political military affairs. So I was advising him on political military affairs in the Middle East. I had some experience, I had some educational background. He very laughingly, as he was walking out the door, and as I went from being his EA to being his successor's EA, tossed his bound dissertation on my desk. It was on coalition building for Desert Storm. Essentially, I spent some time earlier in the year telling him who Khalid bin Sultan was. He had a PhD in who Khalid bin Sultan was. So I think it's less a problem that they don't have the backgrounds to Breedis, Mattis. There are a number of senior flag officers with PhDs in the humanities, but because we are so technologically focused a service, people who have those degrees tend to keep the light under the bushel basket. Trent, you had your hand up earlier?
I need to comment on what you just said. I've got my foot in both the communities. I spent 20 years as a Navy nuke and then went, to the liberal arts side and also had a degree in ops research from the Navy postgraduate school. As a Navy nuke and as an XO on 2 ships, what I found is that the officers who performed the worst, who had the most difficulties, were the ones that came on board the ship with a liberal arts degree, undergraduate degree. And in the current environment where there's an old saying in the Navy, one off ship wipes out 100 attaboys. For the engineer, it's one off ship wipes out 1,000 attaboys. For a nuke, off shits are not allowed, okay? You don't survive as a junior officer unless you've got that technological background. But I was also the curricular officer at the Ops Research Department and trying to teach people at the graduate level. And what I was finding, and when I was getting my doctorate, we saw a lot of people from the technological community going and getting liberal arts degrees. And the liberal arts people hated it because the guys with the technological degrees, 1, were better at it than the liberal arts guys, and 2, did not put up with a lot of bullshit you get from the liberal arts people. When a guy comes in, a postmodernist comes in and tells me that there's no such thing as truth, I've been running a nuclear reactor, okay, there is such thing as truth. Okay, so what I would suggest as an appropriate model is let's get them stemmed early. Let's give them a background in naval history early, a taste of it, and then as they get into the higher ranks, that's when you start teaching them military affairs and grand strategy and naval history and those types of liberal arts things, because they're ready for it and their jobs are going to demand it at that point. End of my soapbox.
We get Trent, and then we'll go ahead and go around.
I'm going to stand up so the panelists can see. A question for Norman, but first a comment on the comment that you made immediately after Alan's presentation. The idea that the War College maneuver rules explain Daniel Callahan's approach to the night battle off Guadalcanal. I agree. I've made that argument. And one of the reasons is there's a bit of a smoking gun in the Naval War College archives. They have graphical depictions of relative fighting strengths. Most of the ones in the file are one treaty cruiser versus another, Exeter versus Pensacola, Furutaka versus New Orleans. But there are ones at the end of that file. And one of those at the end of the file is 3 U.S. treaty cruisers against the Congo. And it's exactly what Callahan tries to do. So we can talk more about that. But to the question, when the Navy, through the wargaming, shifts to an idea of step-by-step rather than the through ticket, how much evidence have you seen in the thinking of the Navy that is going to create a greater problem for the Japanese? Because now there is more uncertainty about where the United States Navy might strike next.
I've never seen them actually talk about the uncertainty. That's my idea. The step-by-step is entirely because unless you do that, you'll end up losing your whole fleet. And then it's interesting when Miller writes about it, he talks about the need to deal with Japanese land-based air. Now, we believe the Japanese mandates were absolutely filled with airfields. And no one ever got a good look at the mandates before the war. And we didn't realize that, in fact, they hadn't bothered until like 36, 38. So there are problems of no comprendo all over the place there. The more you look at pre-war intelligence documents, the less impressed you get. Surprise, surprise. If the attachés had a good time, you got good stuff. The Japanese were real good at shutting it down. And the attachés got very, very little. And then if you believe Prados's book, even when they got something really hot, nobody believed it anyway. Now, I got to say something that I missed. One of the big things we did in wargaming was to act as though the enemy was smart. That is, at some point, someone senior at Newport said, "We're trying to teach you how to deal with a witting enemy." If you look at the British and their attitudes towards their likely enemies, it's like a different world. All of their stuff is, everybody at that time writes racial qualities of the other side. It's a very common phrase. Well, the racial quality we credited the Japanese with was fanatic bravery, which was not too far off, right? With the British, it was, they don't get it. That comes up when they're asking what the Japanese are going to do in battleship building. It's what comes up when they estimate how big a fleet they need in the Far East. It's shot through with that. Now, the flip side of that is that we're not very good at guessing how other people think when they don't think like us. So, for example, we assumed that if we strangled Japan with a blockade, they would see sense and fold. And early on, there were people who said, well, they might not get the joke. And when the warplane was being done in 1929, it was, well, if they don't get it, we burn them down. And they talked about moving Army bombers to the islands we were going to seize to support blockade. But by and large, there's not much sense of how they think. By the way, if you were in the strategic rackets like I used to be, if you look at our plans for intimidating the Russians, there are things that would scare the hell out of us, right? But you're dealing with people, especially like Stalin, who might say, well, do I get to choose which 10 million people get fried? And if you look at someone like Mr. Z, do you really think he cares? You got to be kidding, right? We don't seem to be very good at tailoring ourselves to the way other people think. That's real dangerous. And gaming tends not to be well adapted to that problem. I don't know what is. But the more I've seen of this stuff, the scarier it gets that way.
We have at least 3 more questions. Jamie? Oh, 4 now. Then.
I'd like to take an opposite approach to the we should have everyone be STEM first and then make them be I'm also a nuke, and I'm a history major. And I think the challenge and the problem with that mindset is that there's an assumption that we can train people to appreciate history sometime later in their career. And my challenge and my concern with the idea that we should be STEM first and then liberal arts is that you start off with a pool of people, the thinking pool of people are all engineers. And so when it comes time to make them start thinking about history, they have no incentive to do that because they're all thinking like engineers. Where I think it's more important that we bring in a mix of officers, including history majors and philosophy majors and the like, so that we start off with a integrated at a macro level integration of thought, so that when we are everyone sitting in the room together, we are having the liberal arts answer, the technical answer, the et cetera, to have that conversation in the early port. So when we're pulling our pool of officers to be senior officers, we're pulling from a broad pool to begin with. I think your challenge, and part of our challenge is a lot of times people can skate through ROTC programs in liberal arts degrees that have absolutely no business being naval officers. That is the problem of ROTC programs, not of the fact that they are liberal arts majors.
Could I make a comment on that?
Sure.
My PhD is in physics. Does that say anything?
No, sir, I don't think it does. I just
I
think that
spent-
when we exclusively say all officers should be STEM first, we are first of all, we're cutting out a significant portion of people who are going to be good naval officers, and
Oh,
second
that's
of all,
another problem.
well, yeah, it is another problem.
It is.
But second of all, we are setting up the mindset for the organization to be STEM first, and it's a lot harder to steer them to something else. You are clearly an exception. to
Well,
that,
look,
sir.
Let me make one
if
quick
you're
comment
living
on
in a
yours.
technological world,
One quick comment, back in the 20s and 30s, when aviation was coming up and they needed senior aviation, they set their billets out there, and guys like, name half a dozen officers, senior officers who at the lieutenant commander, and captain level became aviators because the billets were there and the jobs were there. They do the same thing with converting STEMs into historians, STEMs into political science majors.
Not saying that can't be done.
If the billets are there.
Not saying that can be done. I think we're discounting a large percentage of good naval officers if we focus STEM.
Yeah,
I'm also
I-
saying you're
corner
going
and
to
then
end up
drop
losing
low.
those guys
Yeah.
when they can't perform at the junior officer level.
I think I did.
Well, hey, let me talk as a carrier guy. The best pilots behind the boat were English majors. I've had more STEM guys try to kill me behind the boat than not. So, but I'm not a nuke, and I'm a RATSI guy. Now my daughter is marrying a nuke this Saturday, and Jeff and I were talking about this, and she's finding out the community is extraordinarily different than the aviation community. And talking to Caleb, who just came off South Dakota, and as I said in my book, the track for nukes, particularly submarine nukes, is very narrow. You get off that track, you're gone. You have a grade. You have a technical grade, and you guys know this. You have a technical grade that follows you in your career. And how can you what always and to close my comments, the quote that always got me was John Lehman's, a PhD from Cornell, I think Princeton. That we have raised a generation of flag officers who are essentially illiterate in the social sciences.
Yep.
Those were his exact words. And what you saw in the late Cold War was the establishment of a strategy community that helped balance that. And the ops analysis guys, guess where the all ops analysis guys went? They went to N8. All of N8 is OA guys, and they were counterbalanced by the strategy guys. And what's happened since? Strategy committees withered away, and now you have more programmers and more technical thinkers. So.
Question in the corner here, if we can, and see if we can get the last couple in here before we drop dead.
Will Murray, LSU, former Navy guy. Quick point, I guess, this is more of a common question. You all hate to hear that phrase at a conference, right? But I heard some straw man language, and you guys are so smart, and I respect your work, about academics. And as a professor and I teach history, I would just caution everybody not to grab on scholarship too much. And Chinese scholarship is impressive, but I would say some of the research is a little bit retrograde. So the strength of American society is our diversity of opinions. And so my question, though, beyond comment, how do you increase healthy interaction with the academy? I think the FAO program is one great example. I have a friend who also went to Cambridge with me. He did a lot of great work. So I think that's one model of that. But how do you FAOize the Army, Navy, and Air Force Corps officers and increase those academic engagements? What are some positive things we can do?
Well, going back to the comments of the Cold War, throughout the late Cold War, starting in the 1970s, when we started the strategy committee, there was a program that's still kind of going on, but kind of petered out. And that is, you send guys to, I think there was like 6 schools, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, or so, and they did a 1.5-year master's tour, and then they were immediately right back to OPNAV. And there was a closed loop where you went just like the kind of interwar period. You went from operations where you tested the maritime strategy, you got a graduate degree to put things in broader perspective. You went to OPNAV to apply that strategic perspective, and then you went back to the fleet, and that's of course all gone now. So.
Well, it's actually being rebuilt in N7 right now. We're responsible for the strategist community, and we're starting to rebuild that. Tom and then John to finish up.
Hey, KJ.
Sir.
Just from Newport on High, I want to reiterate something that Peter said in his paper. And I would suggest from listening to the midshipman earlier today, midshipman second class son, the power of wargaming is it levels that understanding and an environment for understanding regardless of your background. Because it forces liberal arts and STEM science background folks to look at an operational problem or a tactical problem in a way that they all have to come to it and come to a common language and understanding. And I think that's the power of what the midshipmen are seeing in the wargaming program there. And I would attest that's why I've got 4 stars hanging out in Newport from Sunday night till Friday night during a wargame week. They used to not care. But now we've got their attention, and the burden is on us to make sure they're getting something out of it. So I just offer that as one of the ways to think about going forward.
Okay, Tom?
This story is not necessarily relevant, but I want to tell it real quick. Over 35 years ago, I was editor of the Harpoon Tactics Manual, Harpoon Missile. Yeah, it worked. And I had put right behind the title page a page that said in big letters, "The purpose of this manual is to tell you how to kill the other son of a bitch before he kills you." Okay. The Navy commander, who was the first reviewer, looked at that and ripped that big page right out. And he said, "What hole did you crawl out of?" And no, I mean, I understood him completely, that this was not the way the manual, because I'd studied the other manuals, right? That they're not done this way. But I wanted to grab the attention of the young, especially young officer, right away. Man, this is critical. I did get the attention of that commander.
He hadn't read Patton.
Or seen it, or, yeah. John Haddendorf.
Just to make 2 quick points. Your legend of Admiral Crowe, I can tell you is actually true. As a 4-star, when I was writing History of the Maritime Strategy, I interviewed him in Naples. He was Think South. Had a similar question about his thesis. He stood up, walked to the door, and said, "You're trying to ruin my career, young man." And as a comment about Navy culture and what others in the Navy think about people who do that. So one of the things we're trying to do at the War College now, last 2 or 3 years, we've established this graduate certificate of maritime history, which is just beginning to take hold, and we're beginning to produce some very interesting pieces of applied history. So look for those in publications.
Okay, good. We still have a couple of minutes. Any save grounds? Sean?
The question I would have to ask Alan Zim and Norman Friedman, you sort of point to this, and Trent Horn pointed it too, but we look at wargaming as sort of an alloy good, but it seems to me there's risks of possible negative learning. Do you see examples in the cases you looked at of potential pitfalls of negative learning from wargaming?
I'll start out by saying, yes, there is negative learning. The prime one is that you've got 2 different types of decision makers. Okay, I know that there's like 5, a lot of those. If you want to get tenure, you make up another mode of decision making. But the 2 are cumulative and the intuitive. The cumulatives are people who go through and make decisions on a very methodical basis. They need all the data. They take time, they make great decisions with a very low error rate, but it takes a long time. The intuitive is somebody who can take a small data set, jump to a conclusion, act immediately, higher error rate though. During peacetime, cumulatives are the ones that win, because if you make a mistake in the Navy, your history. So their lower error rate is important. The war game at the U.S. Naval War College catered to the cumulatives. 3-minute moves took 30 minutes of real time. You stood up and looked at the game board, and it's like you had a 10,000-foot view. You got much more data than you would get if you were down, face on the ground, and it was night, and all you could see is flashes of light out there. So the negative learning that came that I would contend is that it catered to the cumulatives, it devalued the intuitives, decision makers, and as a result, if you take a look at those early battles at First Guadalcanal and Cape Esperance, you take a look at the decision making that was happening, and the guys are always give me more data, give me more information. They were asking to open fire at 12,000 yards, and the guy couldn't make a decision until he got to 3,600 yards range. So that is part of the problem that I see at the Wargaming, Naval War College Wargaming. Over to Norm.
I would agree with that. If your war game is skewed badly, you'll reach bizarre conclusions. There was a British evaluation of U.S. officers in January 1942, I think, and they talked about how American officers kept thinking about the odds. And what I think they meant was they kept going for that form of decision-making that's allied to war gaming, where you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do. I saw evidence that the War College tried pretty hard to force people to make decisions on limited data. They weren't dumb. But yeah, if the wargaming is skewed the wrong way, you'll get bizarre results. Look, if you look at strategic stuff, not our business, but the big bang bang stuff, what you'll see is that the results are unbelievably messed up. And they're messed up because the wargaming involves assumptions about how the other side will react. And the assumptions are very often completely off base. I didn't get there, so I've often thought if you vaporize Harvard, more realistic people would wake up. An awful lot of American policy is driven by people who are quite comfortable. And
I know we're right at the end. We did have one more question.
Don't forget.
Okay.
And that's a wargaming type of problem.
That was fun.
Thank you all.
Never